Joining us now, Toni Sacconaghi, Bernstein senior analyst. Let's just talk for Apple, Tony, because we've seen what has been one of the great investments in history. We've seen at least a bit of a pause there, and typically that can be a great time for investors, or there may be the time when it finally isn't. You think this is one of those times for opportunity or caution?
Good morning, Joe. So I certainly lean more towards an opportunity for investors. As you noted, Apple stock has pulled back dramatically. The metric that we like to look at in terms of valuation is what is its price to forward earnings multiple versus the market. And a year ago, it was about 1.5 times. Right now, it's about 1.17 times. And the average over the last 5 years is about 1.3 times. So it's well below its average. And, despite the headlines around regulation, we think Apple's fundamental business is intact. It's in a lull right now because the iPhone is going through a weak cycle. But ultimately, we believe that Apple's business model is intact and is unlikely to be materially impacted by regulation.
Why? If the DOJ got everything it wanted, that wouldn't be material?
I don't think so in the near term, Joe, because the DOJ is talking about monopoly behavior for Apple, but the examples it's citing are things like payments or things like messaging. And you run those through. Okay, so your messaging app works better with Android. Does that mean you change to an Android phone? You're allowed to use double tap payments with alternative payment providers. Does that mean you switch off of your iPhone? So at least the areas that are cited in the DOJ case, yes, I can understand. They're trying to make a claim around monopolistic behavior. But even if there was remediation on the sort of the 5 examples that they cite, other than perhaps the super app, we really don't see that weakening consumers' desire to stay on the iPhone. The iPhone is, consumers are used to using it every day. They still have, things like Apple Maps and iCloud that are difficult to switch off of once you get to use them. And so, no, the simple answer is I think even if the DOJ case largely wins, which I think will take several years, 4 or 5 years to play out, I think the average consumer in the U.S. is pretty locked into whichever ecosystem they're in, whether it's Android or iOS.
Yeah, I'd like to buy an Android phone, and I would do it if it wasn't for Apple's anti-competitive behavior. Those are words that have never been said by anyone, ever. Right?
Correct. Correct. And look, I mean, again, push comes to shove.
That's not why I don't use an Apple, because I'm prevented from getting an Android. That's not why. And that's what I think is so flawed about the whole idea. How about the other two we have up there, Meta and Alphabet, and the EU's approach to those?
Look, I don't cover either of them directly, so I don't want to speak to the investment conclusions. But, there are some lessons that we've learned. Regulation takes a really long time. If we look at DOJ cases, they've taken between 3 and 5 years, including appeals, to ultimately resolve itself. If we look at what's happening now in the EU, there was legislation passed that went into effect in March this month. Called the DMA, and now the EU is coming back and saying, hey, we're not really happy with how companies are responding to this, and they're doubling down. What we found so far historically is, the EU had mandated against Google to offer choice screens, had no impact on Google to date. And so far, the DMA ruling has had no impact. These are really powerful franchises that people are used to using and are comfortable using. And it's unclear to me that regulation at the end of the day is ultimately going to derail them.
The election coming up, Tony, we tried to handicap that. I don't know how to handicap that in terms of antitrust teeth or actions. Do you have an opinion on which administration would mean what to this whole area?
I think it's difficult to say. I mean, if we look at the DOJ case, it was launched 5 years ago under a different administration. And ultimately, the charges were brought to bear against Apple during this administration. And the resolution of this isn't going to happen until, the next administration. So, look, I think at the end of the day, we basically had some bipartisan challenging of corporate America to some degree from a legislator's view.
Okay.
And, most of the issues, quite frankly, are going to play out.